Hi, everybody. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and I am looking forward to thinking about ribit with you. Interest, taking interest, or better yet, not taking interest. These next 2 weeks, we're going to be learning about the Isser of ribit. This week, reasons behind it, and next week, heteriska, the legal circumvention around it. So, what's so strange about ribit? You saw it in a Mishnah that's not in this week's daf, but it is cited within this week's daf, right? So on Bava Metzia Samach Bet Amud Aleph, the Gemara quoted a Mishnah that is on Bava Metzia Ayin Hey Amud Bet that says Ve'elu Ovrim Below Taseh. These are the ones who violate a negative commandment through the taking / giving / overseeing the taking or giving of ribit. Hamalve, v'halove, ha'arev, v'ha'i. Right? The lender, the borrower, the guarantor, the witnesses. So, in short, everybody. The one that really surprises me, or I guess the two that really surprise me, but they're sort of a piece, is why is the love chayev or the lova chayevet? What do you mean? The borrower just decided they want to say thank you for lending me $1,000. I'm going to give you $1,100 back. Sweeten the deal. Why can't I do that? Right? Same thing for the guarantor. Why can't I do that? So I want to think about that with you. Like, what is the issue behind ribit that seems like it's not just about this malve taking advantage of this love, because we don't even allow this love to volunteer to give ribit if they want, right? Now, this is different. Remember, ona'at mammon, when we learned about ona'at mammon, we said the buyer and the seller can both be chayiv and ona'at mammon. But in that case, the seller was chayiv and ona'at mammon by overcharging, and the buyer was chayiv and ona'at mammon by underpaying, right? So there it was to the advantage of the, right? It was to the advantage of the buyer. Here's not the advantage of the loan. They're doing something nice for Mama who gave him something, right? So let's start by looking at the psukim. Before I want to get to 3 different reads of the reason behind this, but I want to start by looking at the psukim. I'm going to look for sharing my screen. Okay. So we have our citation. Okay. So Shmod Kafbet Kafdalet. Im Kesef Talvet Ami, which Chazal im here interpret as when. Right? So when you lend money to my nation, or psha seems to be if you lend money to my nation. Interesting, God calling us God's nation in this context. Et ha'animach, to the poor that are among you. Lo tieh lo kinoshe. Don't act to them like a creditor, right? Lo tisimun alav neshech, meaning don't take interest from them, right? So it's interesting. First of all, the person being described as getting a loan isn't described as like a business transaction as much as it's described as like stuck, right? Like somebody's poor, you're giving them money and you're going to get the money back, but don't take extra, right? So that's sort of the way it's expressed is you're giving something to an ani, you're giving something to someone who's poor, right? Now let's move to Vayikra Kafei, Azan's Bar Mitzvah Parsha, Bahar. Vayikra Kafei, Lamed Hey Lamed Vav. V'chiyamu chachicha, right? So your kinsfolk is down on their luck. Help them out. I think it's interesting. Let them live with you. Also sounds like pretty basic, bare necessities kinds of things, right? I also want to point out the word imach is here again, right? We have like im kesef talvet. There's like a relationship thing going on, right? Im kesef talvet ami in shmot kavbet. When you lend to my nation, etani imach, the one who's poor, who's with you, right? And here it's, you're going to share with this person, and v'chai imach, you're going to let them live with you. And even the next pasuk, al tikach meito neshech v'tarbit, don't take interest, v'yareitem elokecha, fear God, v'chei achicha imach, they should live with you, right? So it's interesting, this sort of relationship build. And certainly, again, it's describing this person as falling on hard times. It's not describing this person as like, a futures trader, which, by the way, I don't know what those words mean, but I know that they mean something to people listening here. Okay. So that's Vayikra Kafei. And also Chicha and Gerentoshav and Ami. all these different pieces between Shmo Kaf Ben and Vayikra Kaf Hey of kind of identity, belonging, that kind of thing. Dvarim Kaf Gimel gives us another Psukim Kaf to Kaf Aleph. Lo tashich la'achicha, right? You should not. Now, literally, Pshat, we're going to read it as don't take interest from your brother, right? But to be honest, it's weird language. It should be lo tashich me'achicha. Don't take from. So lo tashich la'achicha, Chazal are going to learn that it means the lova is not allowed to give interest to the mom, right? So neshach kesef, neshach ovcha, whether we're talking about through money or through food, neshach kol davar asher yishach, anything that could be used as interest. Instead, lanachuri tashich, take interest from the non-Jew. That's already interesting, right? No pun intended with the word interesting, right? That's already interesting because it's achicha, don't. Gervet oshav, don't. Nachri, do, right? But ulachicha lo tashich, not to your brother, not to your kin. Leman yivarach Hashem elokecha, so that God will bless you. B'chol mishlach yadecha. That's interesting also. God's going to give you some special blessing because you lend money not on interest, right? Ala aretz asher shama l'rishta, in the land that you are coming to possess, right? So interesting. We notice all these little things, relational pieces. Ami achicha, but to the nachri you do. So there's like a lot here. The idea that this person is an ani, the idea that this person, needs chayim. It's kind of basic, like bare bones, necessity kind of thing. All of that is going to come into play in the three different explanations of the Isser of Ribit. So I want to thank Rabbi Daniel Feldman, whose book, The Letter and Spirit, I think, came out the same month as mine, Circumventing the Law, both of them on legal loopholes in Chazal. His book is much more Halakha l'maaseh, and he had great marmakomot, both about heteriska and ribit, and I got some of them from him. Okay, so the first approach is the Sefer HaChinuch Mitzvah Samech Chet. So the Sefer HaChinuch, medieval, written anonymously. The way he puts this Isser is he doesn't put it as the malveh can't take from the loveh, or the loveh can't take from the malveh. He puts it as something much more general. It says, Shalom nashit yad bin loveh l'malveh b'ribit. That we don't help interest pass between a loveh and a malveh. Which means it's not even just the malveh and the loveh who are chayav, but there's other people too. So in the section where he always explains the reasons, Mishar Shea mitzvah, the roots of this mitzvah, the reasons for this mitzvah, God wants good society among the Jewish people. Therefore, God said, I want you to get rid of this possible obstacle that could be in your path. What's the possible obstacle? So that one person doesn't end up consuming someone else's wealth, so that other person doesn't even realize it. And then suddenly they're missing all their stuff, right? That would be the effect of people continuously taking ribit from people they lend to. Over time, they end up taking everything from the other person. That's what he's taking. That's the way he's understanding it. It's a societal issue. It's not just this malva and this lova. It's societally, we don't want a malva getting the stuff from the lova's house without there being like a clear decision to give it, or that clear, like, I don't know how to say it, a clear decision to give it. Of course, if there's ribit, it's a clear decision, but there's something a little bit less conscious, it seems, in the loss that's experienced by the lova, right? This is the way ribit works, and it's known. And that's why it's called neshech, taking a bite, right? Like a consumption. And by making sure that the arev, the guarantor, and the sofer, the scribe, and the witnesses also don't participate in this, other people won't do it either, right? So we want to impact as large a sphere of influence as possible, because what we're talking about here is keeping people from doing this in society. We don't want this done. It's not just person A and person B, malva A and lova B. It is any any people who are doing a loan. And in order to stop that, we need to cut it off at its roots, right? The Yetzer Prateh b'Metzia, you can look about Metzia if you want to know more, or in Yoredea Kuf Samach. So that's the first reason. We don't want people sort of stealthily taking each other's wealth. And it's something where it's a societal concern and not just a concern between two particular people. That's one take. And that's why so many people are chayav in it. The Ramban has a different take, right? So the Ramban, by the way, it's interesting. I would say that the Sefer HaChinuch, his notion that the beneficent God who, wants Yishuv Amo, to me sounds like it's pulling from Shmot Kaf Bet, right? In Kesef Talveh et Ami, right? If you give money or when you give money to my nation, right? It sounds like it's something that God's saying, I'm trying to create a good situation for my people, right? The Ramban says something different. The Ramban says it's actually less about, God trying to create a good society for God's people by making sure that there's no like stealthy taking of each other's stuff or less conscious taking of each other's stuff. The Ramban says, actually, the reason why is because halva, a loan between Jews, is tzedakah. It's chesed. It's not a business transaction. And therefore, no one's allowed to do it. Lov is not allowed to do it. The Malv is not allowed to do it. So this lo tashich lachicha, this is the Ramban on Dvarim Kaf Gimel, where we said lo tashich lachicha, you could pshat-wise just explain it as you can't take neshech from your brother, but also pshat-wise, you have a little bit of a problem with the word le, the preposition le. It should be may. So Chazal read it as lo tashich lachicha, you should not give as a love or as a lova, you should not give to the malveh or the malva, yes. Neshech says gamzo mitzvah mevoeret. This is already a mitzvah that we know from Vayikra Kaf Hey. But what's added here? Yosif bekan azara gam love, right? It's adding here that there's also a lo ta'aseh for the borrower. Masha'ein kain b'chol dinei mammonot, which is actually not the case in general in dinei mammonot in monetary matters. She'im ratzahu lizok b'nechasav rashai, a person who wants to, harm their own possessions, meaning a person who wants to give away their own possessions, harm their own possessions, whatever, they're allowed to do that. But because of the regilut of the regularity of this sin, the lova is also warned against doing this. And at the same time, we're told that you're allowed to take ribit from someone who's not Jewish. That's also different. That's not something where you're not allowed to steal from someone who's not Jewish. Like the Gemara Bava Kama says, you're not allowed to steal from someone who's not Jewish. So what's the deal? Meaning ribit seems a little bit different, right? Lovas chayav in it. Also, you're allowed to do it to a non-Jew. So what's the deal? So we say, well, ribit well, here's why. Because ribit, which is something that's done through the agreement of both parties, right? It's only not allowed because they're your kin, right? Because of a sense of fraternity, sense of sorority, a sense of kindness. We don't have to, right? You have to treat your fellow Jew as you would want to be treated, right? Amar, and also it says that's really about Shemitah, but still, when you are going to give a loan, you should not be thinking something ill. It should be achva and chesed. V'alkein amar, and by the way, that's also why the pasuk says, "L'man yirach Hashem Elokecha." God should, in order for God to bless you. That's what it says in Dvarim Kaf Gimel, Kaf Aleph, I think. Ki chesed v'rachamim yaseh machiv, because a person will be doing chesed and rachamim kasher yalvenu b'lo ribit, when they lend money not on interest. And God will consider, it will be considered for that person, for that malveh, for that malvar, malveit, I don't know how people would say it, right, as tzedakah. And by the way, similar, Shemitah cancellation of loans is also about chesed among your family, among the Jewish people. Lakach ne'amar, lakach amar. That's why also with Shemitah, with Shemitah ksafim, with canceling loans, the Torah says at Tanach goes. You actually can, and maybe should, right? You actually are going to collect loans from those who are not Jewish, not because it's bad to collect a loan, right? It's appropriate to collect a loan, but within the Jewish family, meaning within the Jewish people, there is an intra-Jewish ethic that essentially says when you give a loan, you got to consider it to be like, right? So he says more, but I think that's really beautiful. It's a little bit different, right? The Ramban is saying, why is it that nobody's allowed to give ribit, nobody's allowed to take ribit, nobody's allowed to be involved in ribit? Because loans are supposed to be tzedakah when it's Jew to Jew, right? It could be a business transaction when it's outside the Jewish community. But inside the Jewish community, there's an intra-Jewish ethic. Beautiful. So that's a second reason, right? So our first reason, suggested by the Sefer HaChinuch, is God wants a society for the Jewish people to be a society in which you don't have a lova losing their money before they know it. Their stuff is gone. The Ramban, because halva, giving a loan, is actually considered like a chesed, it's considered like a tzedakah, and therefore ribit should have no place in it. A third, and this is somebody I never knew of, and I was so happy to learn of him, Rav Alter Azriel Meir Eger, who was the Grand Rebbe of Lublin. He was born in 1873, and he was murdered in Warsaw during the Shoah in 1941. And he has his own read, his own explanation. And I actually, I gave you a link. I linked his Takanat Rabim, which is a volume about ribit. I linked to it for HebrewBooks.org for anybody who's curious and wants to learn a little bit more. I always think that especially some of these amazing Talmidei Chachamim who perished in the Shoah, it's just, especially in the modern Orthodox community or other Jewish communities, we don't know a lot about them. So it's nice to learn his Torah, right? So in his intro to that book, he says something amazing. So if you've ever been to a funeral, you know that we read Tehillim Tedvav. And in Tehillim Tedvav, we talk about who is the person who is deserving before Hashem, right? And one thing we say is a person who didn't give their money in neshech, they didn't give their money with interest, and they never took shocha, they never took a bribe. So the Rav Alter Eger, and I'm not sure if that's the right way to refer to him, but I think that is the right way to refer to him, because he has a lot of names going on. I don't want to be disrespectful or anything. Says, oh, isn't it interesting? There's a Gemara that I don't think you learned yet, because I think it's on Ayin Bet. I think it's on Ayin Bet. There's a Gemara, Umashinakaratana alav onazesmut inayim or inahem. There is a mention of being blinded in the case of ribit, and we'll explain what that means. Actually, I'm going to skip that. Just go down to Tanya. It's a little bit easier to just go for that. So the second line, Tanya. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Kol mi sheyesh lo ma'ot. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, anybody who has money, umalvesh lo beribit, and lends that money not with interest, alav akatuv, meaning not with interest to a fellow Jew, alav akatuv omer, that's the person about whom that parak in Tehillim, parak Tedvav Tehillim that we say at funerals, kaspo lo natan b'neshech, they never gave their money in neshech, and it sounds like he should have stopped there, but he quotes the whole pasuk, v'shochad al naki lo lakach, and a bribe against an innocent person they never took. O se'ela lo yimot le'olam, and the pasuk, one who does these things will not ever falter. And the Gemara there says, right? Teaches you that somebody who does lend on interest can yimot, right? And here, lo yimot lo is like will not falter, but here it's like your bank account won't falter. So here, anybody who is malva beribit, their bank account does falter. And then the Gemara continues there and has a conversation about it. But point is here's what he says. Yesh lahavin lefi hasiyum halamadta. What that teaches you, right? He says the end where the Gemara says this teaches you that anybody who's malva on ribit, their stuff falters, right? Their finances falter. It says lama mevi kol pasuk v'shochad al naki. Why did we bring the end of the pasuk in Tehillim Tetvav of about taking a bribe? You should have just said anybody who's malva on ribit and takes shochad, right? It says v'nira debalo marbazen. I think that what he's trying to say by including the pasuk, milvad chomer iser ribit mitzad smo hamerubeh b'lavin hamufrashim b'torah v'niskarim b'mishnah perik hey mishnah yud aleph. Aside from the severity of the prohibition of ribit in its own right, which has so many lavim, which is also in that original Mishnah that we were quoting from before that you're going to see on Ayin Hey Amud Bet, right? That are said in the Torah and they're listed in that Mishnah, Bamitzia 5:11, right? Like chapter 5, Mishnah 11. Yesh bo gam smiut einayim. I don't know if it's samiut or smiut. I feel like samiut. I don't know. Yesh bo gam samiut einayim kilokech shochad. Ribit also entails blinding a person, metaphorically speaking, the same way taking interest does. Taking a bribe does. Sorry, I really ruined it. Let's try that again. Ribit entails a certain amount of blinding of people, the same way taking a bribe does. As it says, as it says regarding ribit, ki shochad yaver einei chachamim, right? Shochad, bribery, will blind the eyes of the wise. That's why these two are similar to each other. Shochad and ribit both cause a change in how and what somebody sees, right? What do we mean? Ribit over hanotin v'hamakabel v'chein b'shochad. He says, well, first of all, by the way, their din is actually really the same, right? Dinam shavet. Their din is really the same. When it comes to interest, the giver and the one who accepts it, both chayav. Same thing about bribery. And then he has a nice long parentheses, right? But he says more after the parentheses. V'chein yesh ribit dvarim v'shochad dvarim. And by the way, similarly, you can have ribit that is not just related to money, just like you can have shochad that's not just related to money, right? And that's why they're in the same pasuk, right? Now, let's just think for a second. What do we mean by this, right? What do we mean by this? That you, like, a person's vision may be distorted by, that a person's vision may be distorted through ribit. Well, let's put it this way. I'm walking around Ms. Moneybags, and somebody comes up to me and says, can you lend me money? Fellow Jew. And I say, sure. Somebody else comes up to me, another fellow Jew, can you lend me money? I say, oh, I just promised that other person. And they say, well, I'll give you interest. So now I'm looking at one of my fellow Jews as a little more of a lucrative prospect, right? So the way that Rav Alter Eiger wants to look at this, Rav Alter Eiger wants to look at this, is he wants to look at this as, here's the problem with ribit. The problem with ribit is that it creates preferential treatment. When really, as we saw from the psukim, the purpose of giving a loan in the Torah is to help someone who's poor. And we don't want to create incentives to skip over this poor person because that other poor person is going to scrounge up enough money to give you ribit. And that is the reason why the lova also is not allowed to participate in giving ribit. We don't want to create any sort of preferential treatment. So I love all three of these reasons, right? The Sefer Achinuch's reason of we want to create a society where people aren't sort of slowly but surely losing their money. The Ramban, halva is supposed to be chesed and staka. And Rav Alter Eiger, that we don't want to create preferential treatment for some lovim and not for others. But I think I like Rav Eiger's the best because it's so creative, right? Like, let's start comparing it, right? I started by comparing to ona'at mammon, and he's like, compare it to shochet. It's actually a really good comparison, right? It's when you think about it, it's actually a really good comparison. So I hope that that gives you a little bit of like like a deeper grounding. Of course, we don't know what the reason is for the Isser of rebates, right? We can speculate, but I think the speculation is actually quite interesting, and you can see how it connects back to the relationships in the psukim. You can see how it connects back to like a sense of basic dire needs that people are looking for. You can see how it relates back to sort of the kind of preferential treatment that a Jew would get over somebody who's outside of the community, right? There's, really tzedakah is kind of surrounding all of this, right? We kind of have to change the way that we think about a loan because it's really tzedakah, right? Think about like student loans, right? It's really tzedakah. That's what it's supposed to be. So next week, Bezrat Hashem, Heteriska. In the meantime, don't forget to count the Omer. Be well, everybody.